So we're in week number 3 of our read through the first letter of Paul to Timothy. And this is usually the week we devote to answering questions. So Jeff and I have selected a portion of chapter 2, if you want to peek there in your Bible as we talk about this, that I think arguably the most controversial segment of the letter.
In our culture these days, because of feminism and desires for women to have leadership roles in the church in some quarters,
Yeah, so I thought we might talk about verses 9 through 15 today. And I think especially we ought to touch verse 15 because that may be the one verse in the entire book that people have questions about. But instead of seeing that in isolation, let's look at this segment. Let's just read it together. This is chapter 2, verse 9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making claim to godliness. A woman must receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression, but will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. So a couple of places in that text, that segment, that seem to be lightning rod kind of issues. First of all, verses 11 and 12, where women are to be submissive.
Right.
And so, yes, in our feminist-dominated culture, that is just evidence of the Bible's demeaning of women.
Right.
So how is that not true if she's supposed to be submissive? I think automatically when people see that word, culturally, that's what they think. Submissive means that they are less valuable, less important, and so you become a doormat.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think, submission and doormat, are necessarily the same things. I mean, so some
of course, we'd expect a man to say that.
Well, yeah, I appreciate your going there. But part of it is just, the way you just laid it out. I mean, part of what we've got to push back on is the culture's framing of the issue to begin with, right?
I think that is so important. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first issue is, just like the culture's redefined words like love to really mean just you accept people doing whatever they want. That's how you love them. The culture has redefined and reframed some things and that's really the starting point, is to understand that, for instance, submission does not make you a doormat. Jesus as a human, as God in the flesh, was submissive to the Father. And that doesn't mean Jesus was a doormat. It just meant that Jesus was accepting the role that as the incarnate Son he was to play, within the drama of salvation. And so submission, submitting to a role that you have been given is not necessarily means you're inferior or you're weak. The analogy I like to use sometimes is it's like when a play or a movie is cast, and when they give out, like Academy Awards for movies, when they give out the award for the best supporting actor or actress, what you're saying is that supporting role is, matters. It wasn't the starring role, but they get an Oscar. And the irony is that rarely does the best supporting actor and the best actor Oscar go to the same movie. So the irony is the best supporting actor may have actually been a better actor than the title person in their movie, but yet they played a role. It doesn't mean that they're a lesser actor because they got the Oscar. Right. But the point is they played a role that they were assigned. And so we've got to get rid of this idea and they played it well. That's exactly right. So well that they were awarded above the titular actor or actress. And so we've got to get away from this idea that hierarchy inherently means inferiority.
This is the thing that bugs me about that, because so I'm going to be pretty plain about this. Let's see if I can rattle Jeff. I think we're being played by culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the truth of the matter is that we're called upon to submit all the time in all these other facets of culture. No one has a problem with that at all.
Right.
If I'm driving home today and a white car with blue lights pulls up behind me, sounds a siren, pulls me over.
Right.
I pull over.
Right.
I submit. Even if it's a 22-year-old kid who gets out in the uniform, wearing the badge.
First week on the job.
You know what I say? Yes, sir. Yes,
right.
sir. And submit to him, because that's the role that I'm called to play in that portion of society. And it's that way in every facet of society. Listen, we submit to the governing authorities.
Yeah.
And I know there are people who think they're smarter than the guy that sits in the White House or the guy that sits in the Congress.
Right.
And that may even be true,
right.
but we still submit to the king, right?
Right.
And so it's weird that, and again, I think we've been played by feminists.
Yeah.
On only this issue, in this area and only this area, is submission decided to be this insulting, demeaning role. Everybody in some facet of society has some kind of leadership role, and everybody in some facet of society has to submit to that leadership in some way every day, virtually. And so I just think it's a tempest in a teapot. It's a non-issue that feminists have just created in our culture.
Right. Well, and just in general in our culture, you take a word like equality. Equality of every person in terms of their dignity, their worth, their humanity. Absolutely. But in our culture, we take inequality to mean there cannot be any distinction in roles.
Right.
And in the Bible, or just in the biblical worldview, equality does not mean interchangeable. Does not mean that there aren't, Ephesians 4, right? Christ gave different gifts to the church, apostles and elders, different roles, even though everybody's equally saved, or in certain respects. So just because we're equal in certain areas does not mean we're equal in other areas in terms of interchangeable. And so we need to understand that there, without some sort of hierarchy, there is chaos. There is no authority, and any organization, any entity, any institution cannot accomplish its mission or its purpose without some sort of hierarchy and structure, and people and entities that are lower in the hierarchy submitting to those who are higher in the hierarchy. It has nothing to do with individuals' dignity or worth, but it has everything to do with function and role.
So let's say a word about what this segment says about a woman's function and role. And I think we need to remember chapter 3. We talked last week about 14 and 15 and the fact that Paul is speaking to church family and that relationship. And I think that's relevant here. I think that's what he's talking about, a woman's role in the church family. So what is it saying about her role? Because I think that's another point of confusion sometimes, is what is it saying a woman can and cannot do?
Yeah, I think, again, it's talking about, teaching and having authority over a man in the church. And so again, we're talking about the work that apostles, to go back to Ephesians 4 language again, the apostles, the prophets, the teachers, the pastors or shepherds, the evangelists, that kind of public authoritative teaching in the church. That's not what she is allowed to do. And ultimately, it's grounded not in culture, because that's one of the big pushbacks in the denominational world.
It was just the way it was at that time.
Yeah, just the way it was at that time, or especially the argument today in a lot of commentaries in Ephesus, because of the, remember Diana of the Ephesians, book of Acts, when Paul upsets the silversmiths, and Diana was a goddess, and so it was just, there were a lot of out of control women because of the Diana cult. And so it was really just limited to Ephesus, where, remember Paul says, you're in Ephesus there, Timothy. Paul grounds it in creation, goes back to, and again, part of what we're trying to do in the church is, unlike the rest of the world, in the church, we are trying to show the authority of God, that we recognize creation, that we recognize commandments and covenants, God's organization of creation all the way through. And so that shows in our marriages, that shows in our worship in the church corporately. And so, Paul grounds this in both what creation was supposed to be and how it went wrong. And so, at the end of the day, people get a little bit of, touchy about verses 13 and 14. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And so
he takes us back to the beginning. How often does that happen?
That's the point. God makes Adam first, gives Adam commandments, makes Eve out of Adam, not out of the ground, but out of Adam, to kind of again show a hierarchy there in the very creation of male and female, that within the shared humanity of male and female, there's still a hierarchy. The woman comes out of the man, not out of the ground. She's of him, but not above him. And so, and then, verse 14 reminds us of the story in Genesis 3, where the woman was was deceived and became a transgressor. And, two things going on there. Number one, as we often rightly point out, what Paul's implying there is Adam wasn't deceived. So it's not that he's just throwing the woman under the bus. And Adam is very much, in fact, in some ways it makes his sin worse. She was deceived. It's wrong.
That's my point.
But Adam ate the fruit full well, knowing exactly what he was doing.
Anyone who looks back at Genesis 3 and think Eve looks like the bad guy in that story, she's a bad guy.
Yeah.
But how much worse
is Adam?
The story of Genesis 3 in part is failed leadership.
Right.
A man who didn't step up and fulfill his leadership role.
Right.
And actually was led by his wife.
Well, and that's the key.
Into sin.
And that's why Paul brings that up. Literally, sin and death come into the world because we got the woman making the decisions there. The woman leading the man instead of the man leading and protecting. I mean, we forget that, really protecting the woman.
Right.
That was part of Adam's job that he failed in as well. His job was to protect her spiritually, just like preachers, teachers, elders, husbands as spiritual heads of their families are to be spiritually protecting the women under their care to this day. And so, literally part of what Paul's trying to get us to understand is when we got this wrong before, that's literally how sin and death come into the world, when we botch this divinely given creational order.
So I think that's also going to help with verse 15,
Absolutely.
Isn't it? Which is, again, just the difficult one that folks struggle with. What in the world does he mean when he talks about a woman being preserved through bearing children?
Yeah. So again, what we just saw in the verses right above it, Paul's already told us the context where he's thinking and reading about. It's Genesis 3.
Right.
Does Genesis 3 talk about childbearing? Ironically, that's in there too. Yeah. In Genesis 3, remember, the fallout after they eat the forbidden fruit, God is handing out punishments, and to the woman in particular, there will be pain and suffering and childbirth.
Right.
Your desire will be for your husband; he will rule over you. In a sense, what God is doing is reasserting the original roles. The woman was to be the childbearer. Men can't do that. That's the unique role of the woman. Now with pain and suffering involved.
Right.
And so what Paul's really doing here in context is he's just calling women collectively. I don't think this means every last woman has to have, a child to be saved, get married, and have children. But the point is, what's the unique role of woman in Genesis 3 as God sets things back to right under judgment? And it's for the woman to accept that her role is the childbearer. She's not to be the leader that the man is, that the husband is, that and that trickles into the church. She's to accept her role as the childbearer.
Yeah, and by the way, is anyone going to quibble about which of those two roles is a more significant role?
Sure.
That is the bizarre thing to me, that there are actually people who look at that and say, the woman's been demeaned to the role of bearing children. Bringing in the next generation and playing a critical role in the bringing up of the next generation of human beings. How is that more important than managing a branch of the bank? How does somebody miss that?
Right.
I think the role of mother is just one of the most critical roles on the planet.
And what's funny about that is, for as much as, again, now we'll come full circle to where we started, culturally, this is Paul is a misogynist type passage in the culture. The ironies, to your point, David, Paul himself, then back in 1 Corinthians 11, does talk about the fact that even as he's, again, asserting the creational hierarchy of men and husbands as the head of wives and so forth, in 1 Corinthians 11, it reminds men that ever since Adam, all of us have been born of a woman. And so even though he's not, taking away male headship, he's reminding men, don't get too big in your britches. Understand the reason you've been given your role in the hierarchy, and it's not to look down your nose at a woman, because every last one of us is in the world because of a good woman called our mother.
Yeah.
And so even there, Paul the misogynist, so to speak, is actually reminding men, be thankful to the women, the women in your life who are the reason you're here.
Yeah. And the interesting about that is, and this always just stuns me, the way that culture does not see the consequence of abandoning the plan, the roles as God assigned them. Because what has happened is increasingly we live in an emasculated world where men are not men and they're not leaders.
Correct.
And are being supplanted by women in that leadership role. and all of the sudden now the home is abandoned,
Right.
and that traditional motherhood role has been minimized and demeaned, and so nobody wants to do that. And I just wonder, folks, how's that working out culturally?
Well,
how are we better off?
Right.
Because that's the route we've gone, and I think the answer to that is painfully obvious. One of the things I've noticed, I've been a student of school shootings.
Yeah.
And you start researching the background on school shootings and find out how many of these young people who get involved in that wind up coming from homes
Right.
where that was a factor. The traditional roles were not followed.
Right.
Dad is rarely there or not there, or the couple's divorced and there isn't a family unit. These roles that God assigned are critical, and when
Right.
they're missing, it messes up culture.
That's right. And along that line, David, now you begin to also understand why our culture is so beholden to abortion. Because, and especially as a women's rights issue, as a feminist issue, because the whole idea there is a secularized woman does not want to be a childbearer. She wants to live on the same terms a man does, which is sexual pleasure without any 9-month consequence
Right.
of that. And so that's, again, this reject, now you begin to understand why Paul says it the way he did. The fundamental rejection of the childbearing role, regardless of whether you're married or able to get pregnant or not, for a woman, or women in general in our culture, to reject that with this demand for abortion as a health care, as a woman's rights issue, just shows you again how far we have gone from the divine design, which is why we also can't stand to listen to any kind of hierarchy in other spheres of life that God put in place.
Reading the end of Judges, it's interesting. The last two stories, I think, demonstrate that the people forgot who God was and how to
Yeah.
relate to him. And in the last story, they forgot what it was to be human.
Absolutely.
And so I think that we see the same patterns
Yeah.
in our culture. Listen, folks, there's no way to gloss this over for culture. We're left to decide between two views of life, either God's view, which is right, or to pursue culture. And if that's the choice someone makes, I think the question we would ask is, how's that working out for you?
Yeah.
What do you think about what's happening with culture? So, a lot to be considered here. That was what we thought was an important question in this text. Maybe you have another one. We will have an extra week this month, because it is a 5-Sunday month. So, if you have another question you want to throw in from 1 Timothy, we'll be glad to work on that. Either way, we hope you'll keep reading through the letter this week.